Just a note before we get into this episode. The following interview contains adult themes and the recounting of traumatic events. Listener discretion is advised. It was late spring 1987 when Ursula Barwick, a 17-year-old girl, tall, with blonde hair and blue eyes, stepped off the platform and boarded a train at Tuggerah on the Central Coast. She grew up in Quirindi, a country town in New South Wales with a population of just under 3,000, not far from Tamworth. Known for its colourful display of sunflowers, Quirindi sits on the fertile Liverpool Plains, one of Australia's richest agricultural regions. But despite the seemingly never-ending paddocks, green and dusty brown as far as the eye could see, Quirindi could make people feel trapped. Ursula had visited Sydney a handful of times and fallen in love with it. A city full of life, busy and noisy and bursting with opportunities. It was the opposite of where she'd grown up. The train from Tuggerah would take just over 2 hours, and once she'd arrived, she had a phone call she needed to make. Ursula needed to call her father, Peter, and let him know that she'd arrived safely and she needed to share her address. As far as anyone knew, she had a job and a place lined up. But that call, the one to tell her father that she'd arrived safely, never came. Not 1 week later, not 1 year later, and not 30 years later. But eventually, after decades of waiting, Ursula's family would find out exactly what had happened to her. I'm Jessie Stevens, and this is True Crime Conversations, looking into the world's most notorious crimes by speaking to the people who know the most about them. In this episode, I'm speaking with ABC journalist Winsome Denyer about the case of missing woman Ursula Barwick. Winsome is a reporter-producer for the ABC documentary series Australian Story. She most recently worked on telling the story of Ursula, working closely with her family and friends and documenting their search for answers. Let's begin in spring 1987 when a man named Peter Barwick reported his 17-year-old daughter missing. What did he tell police at the time?
Well, he went down to Sydney, so he was living on the Central Coast. He was given advice that it would be good to go to the police headquarters in Sydney because that way the report would get straight to the people that needed it. So he drove down there. He gave them a photograph of his daughter Ursula and a description. Exactly what was in the description, we don't know because the police have actually lost that original report. So we've never been able to see that original report to know exactly which day it was that he went there or exactly what details were in there.
And why was it that Ursula decided to leave Quirindi?
That's a complicated question, and I think it's something that we'll never know for sure. One, because obviously we can't ask Ursula herself, and also her mother, Cherie, who was probably one of the closest people to her at the time, passed away in 2004. So we can't ask her for her insights either. But from speaking to friends and family, we know that she was definitely going through a rebellious phase in her teen years, and there was something that was unsettling her. So she had gone to Sydney in year 10 to do some work experience as a nanny, and friends told me that they don't know exactly what happened, but after she came back from that experience, she was just a little bit different, and that's when really her rebelling started. And, you know, I think her father says she got a bit of a taste for the big city and the glitter of Sydney at that point. And so probably that put the seed in her mind that she wanted to get out of this tiny country town. You know, if you think about it, there's only about 3,000 people that live in Quirindi. It can be quite stifling as a teenager, and it was actually very normal for country kids at that age and that time in the 1980s to go to Sydney to look for work because there weren't a lot of work prospects locally either. So I think she was probably feeling a bit stifled of the country town, wanting to explore. Everyone describes her as being really confident and outgoing. I also think she was, there was something that was not feeling quite right about her, which was causing this rebelliousness. And she, was doing things where she was getting a bit of a reputation in the town. It's a small town, rumours spread. So I think she probably wanted to get away from all of that. And she wasn't a hugely scholarly person. I don't think school was really a good fit for her. So lots of different reasons, but exactly why, we'll never know for sure.
When Ursula was leaving, there was no bitterness. She was in a joyful mood. It was just a big adventure, and she wanted to have that adventure like so many other country kids did.
Do we know what she was planning on doing for work when she got to Sydney?
Well, she told her parents that she had a job at a jewellery store in Hornsby, and Hornsby's a northern suburb of Sydney, but it turns out that probably wasn't actually true. It might have been a bit of a fib at the time, which, 17-year-olds are prone to do. So whether she thought she would get there and see what happened, or perhaps she'd try and line up some work, I'm not sure. But she did tell her parents that she'd had this job lined up in Hornsby, which didn't end up being the case.
And in Australian Story, you spoke to a lot of her friends and family. How did they describe her? What kind of person was she?
Well, she was definitely a country kid. She, looking at the photographs that the family shared with us, she loved animals. She was apparently her mum had lots of pigs, so she had a lot of time playing around with pigs and horses and all sorts of animals. She also loved children, so she had her 2 little kid brother and sisters through her father's second marriage, but she also had a lot of kid cousins as well. So often in the photos you would see that she had a child on her hip or in her lap, and she just seemed to have a really natural way with children, which is why I think she was interested in pursuing the path of nannying and doing that sort of thing. But bubbly, outgoing, confident, really funny, always the life of the party, wanting to be centre of attention, that kind of person.
And she'd had, although it had been quite idyllic, that kind of country town upbringing, she'd had a difficult childhood in some ways when it came to loss, didn't she?
That's right, yeah. So her parents were Peter and Cherie, and they had a son first, Leandrew, who had a rare illness, and it caused him to, it stunted his growth. So he had a lot of health problems around that, as I understand. And Ursula came along a couple of years later, and they were quite close as siblings, and she would often care for him quite a bit. And then a couple of years after Ursula was born, Peter and Cherie had another child, Christopher, who actually died only a couple of days after birth. So for that family unit, it was a really tragic time, because then Leandrew ended up dying at 8.5. He actually outlived doctors' expectations for a long time, but he did die at still such a young age. So that must have been very difficult for Ursula. She was only 6 or so years old. Difficult for the whole family though as well, and subsequently Peter and Cherie parted ways, and it was a couple of years later that Peter married Elizabeth, and they started another family with Andrew and Kate. But definitely a tough time for a small child like Ursula. That being said, though, it seems that the family, the extended family, were very supportive, and there were lots of cousins around and lots of other family members. And Peter and Cherie stayed on good terms. So they, when Ursula was going between the families, that was all kind of on good terms. And in fact, Andrew and Kate, Peter's children from his second marriage, would holiday with Cherie and Ursula at times up in Quirindi after they'd moved down to the Central Coast. So there was definitely a lot of tragedy and sadness in the early years, but also a lot of love.
Ursula went and lived with Peter for a time, and there was a period where she went to Sydney just to go and visit. And she said she was just going to go for one night, and she didn't. Was that kind of behaviour characteristic of Ursula around that time?
Yeah, so she ended up going to stay with her dad, Peter, because her mother, Cherie, I think, they were very similar personalities, and from what the family told me, they would, one minute be laughing and next minute be yelling at each other. And so they really were butting heads, and particularly when Ursula was really rebelling in her later teenage years. Cherie asked Peter if she could go and stay with her for a little while. Stay with Peter for a little while, I should say. And so she went down there, and it was going well initially, but then this rebellious phase continued. And yes, she told Peter she was going to go to Sydney for the day, ended up not coming back for a couple of days, and Peter actually went to go and report her missing to the local police at that point, but they basically told him, look, she's a teen, she's probably just run away, give it a few days, she'll probably come back, which was very much the attitude at the time. And she did come back. So she came walking up the hill on the Sunday, and they had, quite a boisterous argument, as Peter put it. And I think she was really pushing boundaries and, trying to explore her independence. She'd just turned 17. So there was definitely tension between father and daughter. But I think Peter was very conscious as well that he didn't want to completely push her away, knowing that there were already tensions with Cherie and Ursula. So he definitely tried to work with her and talk to her about what she wanted to do, and that was when she started to talk about wanting to move to Sydney and find a job.
So it was midweek when she was dropped at that train station, and she was on her way to Sydney, and I believe she had sort of some cash and a few other bits and pieces. And it was her job to call when she got to the other end. Did she ever call?
She never called. So the plan was that Peter and Elizabeth were going to drive down and deliver her linen and some bigger items so she could help set up where she was going to stay. But she never called. She was going to give them the address of where to go. So we don't know why she didn't call. I guess a bit of context again, in the late 80s, nobody has mobile phones. There's not always a landline at places. Perhaps she did try and call her parents and they weren't home at the time because answering machines weren't necessarily around. We don't know. We don't know, and we won't know for sure whether she did try and call or whether she just decided that she wanted to run away for a little while. That's one of the big question marks in this story.
She told us that she was going to Sydney, and we said okay. And she was to ring us when she got there to give us the address, but that phone call never came.
From the day that she got on that train, there was just no record of Ursula Barwick. We just didn't know where she was.
And did they panic when that call never came? As you say, they had sort of considered reporting her missing before, but she'd come back. So I can imagine that that's sort of a blueprint in the back of their minds. In the days following, did the panic start to rise?
Yeah, so as they explained to me, the first few days they thought, oh, here she goes again. She's just gone off for a few days and she'll be back. But the days passed and days passed. They spoke to Cherie. She hadn't heard anything. None of the school friends had heard anything. So they did start to get concerned. But I guess in the back of their minds as well, that original advice they'd had from the police locally was that, no, she's just a teenage runaway. So they weren't really sure what to do. But once it got to 2 weeks, they just felt sure that Ursula wouldn't have left it that long to get in touch. So that's when Peter went down to Sydney and officially reported her missing.
And did they have any theories about what might have happened? Was there anyone that, an ex-boyfriend or something that might, explain something sinister happening? Was there anything that sort of came to mind for them in those early stages?
I think they were really at a loss. I guess they probably thought that she was spreading her wings and trying to just explore the world and maybe wanted a bit of independence, and again separating herself from some of the rumours and chatter that had been going on in her local hometown. And I know that Cherie did get in touch with the people that Ursula had nannied for when she was in year 10, the year prior, but they couldn't give them any more information. They often spoke to the school friends, Cherie and her aunt, who were in Quirindi, but no one had heard anything. So that was really curious because Ursula was so social. It was just strange that she hadn't contacted anyone at all. And so I think they assumed that she was, just trying to find her own way for a little while and that she would eventually call. And everyone in the family thought, well, she definitely wouldn't miss Christmas because it was her favourite time of year. She loved the kids. She loved having the kids around. She knew that there would be presents under the tree for her. So they all, I think, held on to the hope that she would turn up again at Christmas, and Christmas being just a couple of months after she'd gone.
And was it at that point that you think people started to think she's not someone who just doesn't want to be found? Because I would imagine that there'd be a turning point and that perhaps for those few weeks maybe she didn't want to be contacted, but if Christmas meant a lot to her, do you think that for the family that was a point where they sort of went, something's not right here?
I think so, and this is the challenge with families who do have a missing person in their lives. It's that uncertainty that's the absolute killer. I mean, you start questioning, did we do something? Why isn't she coming back? Is it because she doesn't want to come back, or has something happened? And on one hand, you don't want to think that something's happened, because you hope that they're okay, but then it's quite painful to think that they're not making contact intentionally. So it's a really difficult balance, and I've heard experts in this area talk about that as this ambiguous loss, because you're just going around and round in circles and you don't know what to think. But certainly after Christmas came and she didn't turn up or make any contact, I think, the family really became concerned, but still just did not know what to do.
And over the years, obviously, her mother and father grew, concerned and completely lost about what had happened. What ended up happening to Cherie? Like, she sort of didn't know decades on what had happened, and she ended up passing away, didn't she?
That's right. So Cherie had obviously, tried her best to speak with friends and keep in contact with Ursula's connections and with Peter to see what had happened. But as the years went by, there were just no answers. There was at one point, with the, advent of DNA technology, the police did take Cherie's DNA, but 17 years after Ursula went missing in 2004, Cherie was diagnosed with bone cancer, and she deteriorated quite quickly and passed away without ever knowing the truth, which is really sad.
And in 2010, the Australian Federal Police launched a campaign which was using age progression technology, which was quite new, and it produced an image of what Ursula might have looked like at 40. But there were some friends and family who weren't particularly happy with that image. Why was that?
Yeah, so Ursula's cousin, Melissa, who at the time that Ursula had gone missing was about 14 or 15 years old, so quite young. I think obviously by that stage, 2010, she'd grown up, matured, was an adult, and I suppose was engaging, when she saw Ursula's face come up on the television, was engaging with it in a different way, and really noticed that the age-progressed image of Ursula, her hair was brown, her eyes were brown, and the date she went missing was actually Ursula's birthday. It wasn't the date that she'd gone. And so she thought, how has this gone so wrong? So she actually made a lot of phone calls. She contacted the Australian Federal Police because they were the organisation that had run the campaign. And unfortunately, the way the policing system works in Australia, the Australian Federal Police has a missing persons unit, but then there are also state state-based missing persons units and state-based police investigations. And their response to her was, well, look, we can't change these details unless the case is reopened, and that's a matter for New South Wales Police, not for the AFP. So she started making other phone calls, trying to find out what information she could. Also, at that point, she re-engaged with some of Ursula's school friends who they were a few years older than her at school, so they'd sort of lost touch. But through this Facebook page, they were able to reconnect. And quite a few of the friends sent Melissa some really interesting information. So she started to put a spreadsheet together of the information she was gathering in the hope that if and when the case was looked at again by New South Wales Police, she'd be able to give them that information.
And what kind of information was coming out of that?
So Melissa Donnelly, who's one of Ursula's school friends, had kept these letters that Ursula had written to her not long before she went to Sydney when she was down staying with her dad. And, the tone of those letters was very much, I'm having fun, I'm really happy, I'll see you guys again soon, I'll be back soon. They were also dated the 6th of September, which clearly contradicted the date that was on the missing persons profile, which was Ursula's birthday, and that was the 14th of August. So you would have to assume that the data entry, whoever entered that data just must have put the birthday as the last seen date. So the letters helped with that date. Also just in terms of Ursula's mindset at that time, an insight into her mindset. There was also another girl who had gone to Corindi High who had actually seen Ursula in King's Cross around about the time that she went missing. So that was evidence that she had made it to Sydney, because all the family knew was that she boarded the train and was bound for Sydney, but who knows where she ended up. So this friend Angelique had seen Ursula in King's Cross, but at the time didn't know she was missing. So just said hi, and Ursula said hi back and went on her way. And it wasn't until she got back to Corindi that she told her mother that she realised that Ursula was actually missing. So, if only those things had been picked up at the time, who knows, how quickly it could have been solved, or perhaps somebody could have said to Ursula, give your parents a call. So there were all these little bits and pieces that were coming to cousin Melissa, and she was putting those all together to try and form some sort of timeline.
Before she was leaving, Ursula wrote a letter to me and a letter to our small group of friends. And she says, I'm pretty good, thanks. I'm having fun down on the coast. I'm down visiting my dad. How's school? I thought the police would come and get those letters from me, so I held on to them, but they never did. And she misses us all. That's 3 or 4 times through here. She said, I miss you, can't wait to see you. On her little cartoon, see you soon.
There was no indication at all that she wanted to just disappear.
For a 17-year-old girl to run away, it always has surprised me that nobody came and spoke to us about what was going on in her life, what she was thinking, what she might have told any of us.
The question that begs is why detectives didn't have that information, and why police hadn't compiled a spreadsheet of that sort. Had friends and family, especially those friends who had those letters, had they ever been interviewed formally?
Never. So no one was formally interviewed, friends, family or acquaintances. I know that Cherie, Ursula's mother, did speak to Melissa, who had the letters. So she called Melissa, and Melissa read the letters out to her over the phone, but she never actually gave the letters to Cherie. So we know that Cherie knew about the letters, and we know that Cherie also spoke to Angelique, who had seen Ursula at the time. But unfortunately, this is something that we'll never know for sure, because Cherie's not around to tell us. But whether she passed that information on to police, or whether she tried to pass that information on to police, we don't know. But it's never been in the police records. So suffice to say that the police have never had those letters or information about that sighting until much more recently. And
in 2014, new detectives took over the case. What sort of hunch did they have? When they looked at it from sort of a bird's eye perspective, did they think they were looking at a homicide?
Yeah, so I think initially they were looking at the possibility that this case could have been a homicide and were investigating it in that way. But I think quite quickly, once they had spoken to Peter and Elizabeth, they realised quite quickly that it probably wasn't. So they were the first police to do official interviews with any of the family. So they interviewed Ursula's father, Peter, her stepmother, Elizabeth. They interviewed her aunt, Diane, cousin, Melissa. They went back to Corindi. They interviewed a lot of the school friends. They took Melissa's letters that she had. They interviewed Angelique, who'd seen her in King's Cross. So they really just investigated absolutely everything they possibly could and, took things to the nth degree and, weren't sure exactly what they were dealing with, whether Ursula was indeed alive, but I think they suspected that something had happened, but probably not homicide.
And Ursula's face became sort of synonymous with this new missing persons campaign, which actually triggered the memory of an old colleague of Peter's, Senior Constable Adam Marsh. And he'd developed a sort of different system for searching for missing persons, hadn't he?
So what actually happened was it was Peter's son Andrew. As he'd grown up, he became a policeman. And part of the reason that he wanted to become a policeman was because he thought, well, maybe this might be a way that I could try and find my sister Ursula. So when he joined the police, he worked with Senior Constable Adam Marsh, and not long after that, Adam Marsh was seconded to the missing persons unit. And it was at that point that Andrew Barwick, Ursula's brother, said to him, I've actually got a sister who's been missing long term. If you happen to see anything or read anything about it, or if there's any information you can pass on to my parents, I'd be really grateful. And that was that. Adam Marsh said, sure, no worries. And nothing really came of it at that time. But then in 2015, when Ursula was the face of Missing Persons Week, Adam Marsh saw multiple photos of Ursula because she was all over the TV news. There were posters everywhere. And he's given a statement where he says it sent chills down his spine because it reminded him of a hunch he'd had 5 years prior where he'd looked at a case of a girl that had died in a car accident and he had suspected it was Ursula Barwick. But she had an alias of a different name, which was Jessica. So that was a very confusing point. And at the time, 5 years prior, he tried to make a connection, but he didn't have a lot of luck, and he tried to push it further by putting out a media release, but it was sidelined by his superiors. So that hunch that he'd had, that he tried to look into it, he was basically not encouraged to go any further, so he didn't. And it wasn't until 5 years later that he saw all these other photos that he really became convinced, and he just felt he couldn't let it go and let it lie any further. So he'd moved on from missing persons at that point, but he alerted his superior at the time, who then passed that information on to the current missing persons unit team, and they then passed that on to the King's Cross detectives who were investigating Ursula's case.
And there were photos from this scene, weren't there, of the actual car accident, and they were shown to Peter and Elizabeth. What was their response when they were confronted with those photographs?
So this case that Adam Marsh had seen where he suspected it was Ursula, that the young girl had died in this car accident, and it was quite gruesome, but there were photographs from the crash scene and also from the morgue, the body lying in the morgue. And so this was really crucial in determining whether this girl actually was Ursula. And it was the photographs that really convinced Adam at the time. So the detectives who were looking into Ursula's case then in 2016 brought the photographs around to Peter and Elizabeth's house so they could try and identify them. And yeah, it was a very grim afternoon because the photographs, when we showed them on television, we tried to treat them as much as possible because they are incredibly grim to look at, and there were serious injuries. And it's strange as well because looking at a dead person, their face is completely relaxed and they really don't look like themselves. But Peter and Elizabeth said the closer they looked, the more they recognised the teeth and the nose and the eyes. And then there was a photograph of this body laid out near the car, and the tousled hair and the clothing and the body shape, Peter and Elizabeth just were convinced that this was Ursula, because there's another photograph they have of her where she's lying down at a picnic and she's wearing very similar clothing, the blue jeans and the white top and her tousled hair, and it's almost as if she's just put her head down in this photograph near the car, and she's lying down there like she was in the photograph at the picnic. So they were pretty convinced that night that it was her. So it was a very long and difficult night for them.
I can't imagine that shock after all those years as well. And wasn't there also details in terms of height and weight and, as you say, body shape, where it perfectly matched the description of this missing person? Yeah,
so on the case file, I guess it's standard procedure that when there's someone's died in a car accident, they take the weight and they approximate, the height and the details: fair hair, Caucasian, blue eyes. All of these details matched up to Ursula. The things that were different were the fact that nobody really knew exactly who she was because she didn't have any identification on her. Again, being the 1980s, people don't have mobile phones. She didn't have a driver's license, no bank cards, that sort of thing. And the three other guys in the car had only known her as Jessie. She'd told them her name was Jessie or Jessica. So on the report of this deceased person from the car accident, they'd given her an alias of Jessica, known as Jessie or Jessica. And the police had approximated that she was maybe 25, but the boys in the car had told them that she was probably more like 17 or 18. So similar age range, but I do think that suggestion that perhaps she was a little bit older also made it more challenging to compare the two cases, because Ursula could look older. You look at photographs of her and sometimes she looks very mature for her age.
What was Ursula doing in that car that day?
From what we know from speaking to Hans, who was the guy that stole the car, and also Kerry, who was another person that was hanging around in that group of people where Ursula was, she had ended up going to King's Cross when she arrived in Sydney. And we don't know exactly why, whether she'd already met these people on a prior trip to Sydney or whether she'd just gone down there and tried to find people. But she had met a guy called Mark who, according to Hans and Kerry, was her boyfriend. And Mark had only arrived in Sydney a couple of weeks prior as well. He'd come from Melbourne. And they met Hans and Hans's mate Robert. And Kerry at the time was the girlfriend of Robert. So they were all hanging out. And then this day Hans came and said, "I have stolen a car. Why don't we go for a drive?" And they went joyriding around and then obviously got talking and decided that they were going to go to Melbourne because Hans hadn't been to Melbourne before. Mark was from Melbourne, so he was going to go and show them around. And Robert went as well, and Ursula, or Jessica as they knew her, really wanted to go too because Mark was going. So Kerry decided not to go because she thought she'd get in a lot of trouble from her parents. But they set off, and I think it was very much of a spur-of-a-moment decision. Set off in the evening, and Hans was driving, Robert was in the front seat, and Mark and Ursula were in the back seat. And they ended up getting to around the area of Yass, and they switched drivers. So Robert started to drive. Hans was still in the front seat, and the two in the back. The two in the front seat were wearing seatbelts, but it sounds like Ursula and Mark were lying down in the back, so unlikely to have been wearing seatbelts. And Robert set the cruise control in the car at 120 k's an hour, fell asleep at the wheel, and the car veered into the path of a semi-trailer laden with steel.
What happened to the other people in the car?
Mark, who was in the back seat with Ursula, is a paraplegic as far as I understand, and I believe he has no memory of the accident. I haven't spoken to him myself, but from the coronial inquest that's happened, he has no memory of the accident. So obviously fairly severe injuries. I believe he had to be airlifted to Sydney immediately after the accident. Robert and Hans, who were in the front seat, both sustained quite severe injuries as well, but not life-threatening. They both recovered, but Hans obviously went to prison for stealing the car, and Robert went to prison for, dangerous driving causing death. So it's shattered both of their lives as well. So all three guys in the car, their lives have never been the same since this crash.
Do we have any idea why she would have changed her name? That's the biggest question, I think, when looking at this story, because it just, if she told them her name was Ursula Barwick, then the whole trajectory could have been different. Why do we think that she changed her name?
This is another part of the story that will always remain a mystery, but there are some clues. So when Ursula had written those letters to her friend Melissa just before she left, she had been speculating about baby names. If she had a girl, for example, and she had written a couple of names down, and Jessica was one of those names. So there was a hint there that she obviously liked the name Jessica. Why she actually decided to introduce herself as Jessica and not as Ursula, it's hard to say. Her friends have speculated that perhaps she was just trying to turn over a new leaf and be someone different, considering she, had a bad experience in her hometown where there were rumours about her. Also the fact that Ursula was a fairly old-fashioned name, and perhaps she wanted to feel, modern and trendy with these cool kids from the city. But that's all speculation. We don't know for sure. And, as Elizabeth, her stepmother, said, she thinks that she probably changed her name on a whim to Jessica, not thinking that that would be her name for the next 3 decades.
And what happens to a body when they find it and they've got this name, Jessica Pierce or Jessie Pierce, and then they can't identify her formally? What happens to a body in that situation? So whether this is standard procedure from that time, I'm not sure, but what happened to Ursula's body was it was taken back to Sydney, because obviously through interviewing the 3 other guys, they knew that they had come from Sydney. So they knew that this Jessie or Jessica was probably from there. So she ended up in the Glebe morgue in Sydney. The body sat there for 5 months while police investigated and tried to find out who this person was. After 5 months, a girl came in who was supposedly a friend of Jessie and identified her and said, yep, that's my friend Jessica Pierce. So that's where the Pierce name came from, and said that she'd known her for 3.5 years, which is impossible because Ursula was 14 years old in Quirindi 3.5 years prior. So, and police have never been able to find this friend again. So it's a bit curious as to where that friend came from. But because she was not next of kin, that wasn't counted as a definitive identification. So Ursula's body sat in the morgue then for another 10 months while presumably investigations continued. There was a coronial inquest held in Wagga Wagga, which was near where the crash happened in 1988, but that was not able to determine definitively who this person was. So she was marked as unidentified number 216, I think it was, known as Jessica Pierce. And that's when they elected to bury her body in a pauper's grave at the Emu Plains Cemetery, which is near the Blue Mountains in Sydney.
And in a really unfortunate series of events, the man that was burying bodies at that time was a really sloppy record keeper and never wrote down exactly where she was. So we can see from the records that he did bury this Jessica Pearce, but where, in which plot, and whether she's in with other people, we don't know. So they've never been able to exhume the remains.
Have the family had the opportunity to go there and say goodbye and have some sort of formal sort of almost like a funeral ceremony in order to say goodbye to this person that they never got to properly mourn?
Yeah, so I think that was a really important moment for the family. And unfortunately, because of our court processes and backlogs in those processes, it was quite a long wait. So when the police first came and showed Peter and Elizabeth Barwick those photographs and they identified Ursula, that was in around May 2016. They then had to wait for the police to, prove that this was Ursula in other ways, not just through the photographs, to really concrete the case. That was then sent to the coroner, and while they were waiting for the coroner to name a date for the inquest, they couldn't say anything about it because it wasn't officially legally recognised. So they had to sit and wait. Eventually, the coroner actually gave them special permission to have a memorial for Ursula in July 2017 because there was such a backlog in cases and they knew that it was going to take a while. So they were granted this special permission, and more than 50 friends and family gathered at Emu Plains Cemetery to farewell her. They've got a plaque down at the cemetery now, which is a plaque among many other people who they don't know exactly where they're buried because of this lack of record keeping. And they had the ceremony around about where they think she might be, which is this grassy area. So people were throwing flowers onto the grass, and it's beautiful and poignant in one way, but so sad in another that they'll never know for sure exactly where she is. So I think that was a really important moment for the family to just have that finality and that chance to say goodbye. And, a funny thing that Peter and Elizabeth said was when the school friends arrived, they were expecting to see 17-year-olds. But of course, 30 years had passed. So these friends of hers were now, 47-year-old women. And I think that was a real indicator of just how much time had passed.
And what Ursula might look like if she was still here today.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for speaking to us. We really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ursula is buried at the Emu Plains Cemetery. They don't know whereabouts in that cemetery because there were no records and there is no headstone.
We've just got a plaque on this wall that's down there. That's as much as we could do to say goodbye.
When we had the memorial for Ursula, because there'd been nothing done, I just thought to myself, there was a lot of other people who would have been touched if she had survived.
There was a lot of bad luck involved, even in finding her. But I think that she would be extremely happy that we did find her. And I think that she would have been overjoyed to see us there that day.
To watch the Australian Story episode on the case of Ursula Barwick, just follow the link in the description of this episode. For links to Winsome's reporting, additional photos and discussions on this episode, don't forget to join our closed Facebook group. Just search for True Crime Conversations on Facebook. True Crime Conversations is a Mamma Mia podcast, hosted by me, Jessie Stevens, and produced by Elise Cooper.